Hello, everyone. I'm Rhoda Shermer. Thank you so much for joining NFRPP for our February program covering anti-Semitism. So I want to thank our speakers who are joining us tonight. We really appreciate your being here, and that is Kurt Braddock, Roger Berkowitz, our moderator discussant, Kathy Berger, and Jeffrey Herbst. Before I turn the program over to our discussant moderator, Roger Berkowitz, I want to talk to you about the Q&A. It's a reminder that you go to the bottom of your screen, click the Q&A, and keep your questions coming throughout the program. And when we open the session for the Q&A, Roger will have been viewing the questions and he will field them to our speakers. So with that, I'm going to introduce Roger, who in turn will introduce the speakers, and we'll start our program. So Roger, glad to have you back for NFRPP. It's wonderful to see you.
It's great to see you, Rhoda.
Thank you. Roger is, as I said, the discussant moderator, and he is the founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities and the professor of politics, philosophy, and human rights at Bard College. He's the author of Gift of Science, Leibniz, Modern Legal Tradition, and other books, and he writes for many periodicals. So with that, Roger, I'm going to turn the program over to you, and sit back and listen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rhoda, and it's always great to be back at NFRPP. You guys do great programs, and it's always a pleasure to be with you. It's hard to say it's a pleasure to be around to talk about anti-Semitism, but it is something that is part of our world, along with cognates like racism and Islamophobia and transphobia and other things. So, you know, these are important parts of the world we live in that have to be confronted. And we have three excellent speakers today to lead us through an attempt to understand and think about anti-Semitism in our world today, what it is, how dangerous it is, how it works, how we can think about controlling it through in response to it, and if there's any way to respond to it in a meaningful way. The three speakers, and I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they will be speaking. And I have an understanding that they're each going to speak for about 10 to 12 minutes. And then I'll engage them a bit in a discussion, try and clarify some issues or broaden some issues, and then take questions for the Q&A function. So the first speaker will be Dr. Jeffrey Herbst, who is the president of the American Jewish University in Los Angeles. He was previously president and CEO of the Newseum and the Newseum Institute in Washington, D.C., which is a museum dedicated to the inquiry into the First Amendment and free media. And these are obviously important questions for us today as we think about anti-Semitism. He's also the author of the award-winning book, States and Power in Africa, and has published widely in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, Jerusalem Post, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and others, and received many awards and fellowships. So welcome, Jeffrey. Dr. Kurt Braddock is an assistant professor in the School of Communication at American University. Kurt's research focuses on understanding the psychological effects of extremist communication, as well as how those effects can be undermined to prevent violence. So how do they work? How does extremism work? And how can you respond to it? His first book, Weaponized Words, The Strategic Use of Persuasion in Violent Radicalization and Counter-Radicalization, obviously is going to come up in our discussion today, and we should all go out and get it afterwards. Dr. Braddock advises several national and international organizations, including the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and the Department of State. And our final speaker, certainly not last, is Kathy Berger, who's the Director of Research at the Dangerous Speech Project. Kathy studies the relationship between speech and intergroup violence, as well as civil society responses to dangerous and hateful speech online. She's going to talk a lot about how social media contributes to the proliferation of anti-Semitism online and how to counter that social media proliferation of anti-Semitism. So with that said, let me get right into the speakers and welcome Dr. Jeffrey Herbst.
Well, Roger, thank you. Rhoda, thank you. And thank you also to NFRPP. It's really a pleasure to be speaking with you at last on an unfortunate topic, but I'm glad that we're able to devote such a time to this issue and honored to be with my fellow panelists today. It seems unarguable that anti-Semitism has increased over the last few years. While the concept is debated and individual studies may be somewhat problematic, the overwhelming weight of the evidence suggests that on social media, on college campuses, in terms of what Jews fear, Jew hatred has increased. According to a study that released this week by the American Jewish Committee, 43% of Jews now view anti-Semitism as a serious problem, and 82% think that has increased somewhat or a lot in recent years. I will tread very lightly on the actual data because given the news coverage, given what we hear, it seems that we are confronting a real problem. And I wanted to begin the discussion of what's happened and then hand it off to my colleagues who have very important insights. Of course, anti-Semitism has a long history in the world and in this country. I'd say in the past, classical anti-Semitism was often entrenched publicly in elite institutions, whether it be government, universities, churches, which didn't hide the fact that they were biased against Jews. That changed, of course, through difficult struggles, but over the course, especially of the second half of the 20th century, where public manifestations of anti-Semitism, irrespective of what people thought privately, became unacceptable. And of course, the American Jewish population succeeded in the United States by almost any measure. What we've seen today, and my colleagues will be discussing in greater depth, is a much more difficult set of concepts. The anti-Semitism is not driven by elite institutions. It's a more amorphous problem. It comes from the extreme right-wing nationalists. It comes from the left. It comes sometimes in uncoordinated ways from social media, which we'll discuss at greater length. And it comes from some celebrities for reasons that we're not quite clear on. And this uncoordinated groundswell of hatred is at once more difficult to understand and more difficult to combat than when anti-Semitism was more publicly entrenched in elite institutions. It's also potentially quite dangerous. We've seen some instances of murder in the last few years in synagogues in the United States, some violent attacks against people who are visibly Jewish, and then a chilling atmosphere on college campuses and elsewhere. And then finally, the current bout of anti-Semitism is hard to understand because some of it, but by no means all, is wrapped up in disputes about Israel and about Zionism, and whether criticisms of Israel and the Zionist project are or are not anti-Semitic, and when that line is crossed. And that is also a relatively new phenomenon in the long history of anti-Semitism in the United States. Now, why has this all come about? My colleagues will be delving into greater issues. I think it's important to say at the outset that hate and polarization in the United States, by almost any measure, has increased in the last few years, and anti-Semitism is one indicator of that. At the same time, it seems that anti-Semitism is a leading indicator of where society is going, and there's some substantial evidence that Jews feel a greater burden from hate and polarization than many other groups, that an even disproportionate amount of bigotry, violent attacks is devoted to Jews. But before we get into the specifics of anti-Semitism, it is important to say that there are real structural problems that our society is facing, and that this is simply one manifestation. As Roger said, there are many other hatreds and bigotries against Asians, against African Americans, against members of the Muslim faith, which have to be understood at the same time. To combat anti-Semitism, the American Jewish community has developed an extraordinary array of organizations. Some are old, like the Anti-Defamation League, arguably the leading organization opposing both hate and anti-Semitism in the United States. Some are new, some are well-funded, some are startups. They seem to occupy almost every niche of the ideological spectrum from right to left. And there's been an enormous increase in funding of these organizations over the last few years, and enormous amounts of innovation, especially as it becomes clear that one of the primary vectors of modern anti-Semitism is social media. And Jews and non-Jews have done an enormous amount of work in this country to explore the history of anti-Semitism. As preparation for this talk, I looked online about how many Holocaust memorial and museums there were in the United States, and was frankly surprised to see how many dozens of memorials and museums across the country, big and small, have been devoted to understanding the genocide against the Jewish people in Europe in the 1940s. There's no lack, it seems, of awareness of the problem, at least among Jews and their many supporters, and an extraordinary array of organizations, talent, money devoted to it. Yet, and a whole variety of tactics have been adopted, from education to public shaming to counterattacks and counterspeech. We'll be talking more about that, to point defense, hardening of synagogues and other institutions. If you go into most synagogues today, they shockingly seem like armed camps with armed guards, fences, and other access control points, and also significant efforts made at allyship, of developing allies among other groups that are especially vulnerable to bigotry in our society. Yet this extraordinary organizational effort, the increase in money, the innovation, the variety of tactics, has failed to stem the increase in anti-Semitism. And this is a question that has bothered me, and I think that has to be explored in depth. Why have we failed? It's not victim blaming. I don't blame the people who are receiving the anti-Semitism for this. And it may, in fact, be that things would have been even worse if we had not developed this extraordinary organizational array and done all of this innovation. It may be that the wave of hatred is simply too great, even for the dedicated professionals who work in many of these organizations. But I think we still have to wonder why this has happened, given that the problem has not been ignored, at least by the Jewish community and its many supporters. I don't think the answer is in lack of coordination. Organically, a very large number of bodies have developed to fight anti-Semitism without a coordinated effort, and I think that's actually good, given the kind of phenomena that anti-Semitism is today. Itself, an uncoordinated venture of a significant number of people, needs to be fought, I think, in a decentralized manner. The last thing I think we need is an anti-Semitism czar to coordinate all the efforts. We're much better off in a much more nimble, much more fragmented approach where different organizations can try different things and hopefully will hit upon some solutions, as we'll discuss in a few minutes. So I don't think the architecture is wrong, but we still face a problem. I'll conclude by saying, I think one area that we have to think much more about is order in our society in general. The Jews and other marginalized groups or other groups that face bigotry are in danger when order begins to break down in our society. And I think, for instance, some of the Jews who called for a defunding of the police after George Floyd's murder have now had second thoughts because they see in Brooklyn and elsewhere that the very real physical threats that some people face have to be deterred by the police. But in our society, there seems to be a breakdown in order in important ways. In Los Angeles, in the last 2 days, Jewish people leaving synagogue services have been shot. It's not clear whether those were hate crimes or not, but the mere fact that people are being shot in daylight on the street in heavily trafficked areas in the second largest city in the United States suggests that there has been some kind of breakdown of order, whether it's because of not enough police, too many guns, or lots of other reasons that people can think of. And I think that part of the solution to understanding how to protect the Jews and others who are susceptible and vulnerable to bigotry is to think about how we can reorder society so that we are all safer, especially the groups that are at the receiving end of this bigotry. That's a difficult set of problems. It's one that doesn't have an easy solution, but given that we've tried so much and we're still facing this tidal wave of hatred, further exploration is necessary. Roger, let me stop there. I know my colleagues have very important contributions. Let me hand it over to them, and delighted to talk further about this subject in the Q&A.
Thanks very much, Jeffrey. And let me just say in the Q&A, please keep your remarks, respectful. And also, we will get to them after the talk. So I'm going to now turn it over to Braddock. Kurt, you're up.
Roger, thanks. And Jeff made several comments in the last section that I'm going to build upon, I think, maybe not as eloquently as Jeff did, but given my background, I think I can add a couple of things to what he's already mentioned. As a communication researcher, I'm interested in the ways that messages influence the way people behave. And traditionally, anti-Semitism and hatred towards Jews, historically, as Jeff said, has come from the elites, and it's come in a very vocal sense. In the past, anti-Semitism has been out front, and people have been vocal about being anti-Semitic and about their biases and stereotypes related to Jewish people. Now, though, Jeff used a word that I really actually like as a way it's described. He used the word amorphous. And in looking at the different ways that anti-Semitism manifests in the United States, especially, it seems to be an increasingly amorphous kind of phenomenon. To explain what I mean by this, consider the kind of research that I'm doing now and kind of what I'm going to talk about here for a few minutes. I am specifically interested, not just with respect to anti-Semitism, but all kinds of hateful ideologies, about the ways that subtext and the ways that things we call dog whistles and kind of unspoken messages, things that we imply, the way that those affect the way that people think about things. And the research that I'm doing shows that anti-Semitic rhetoric is growing increasingly prominent among even our elected officials, though it's much more subtle than it has been in the past. And to give you a couple of examples, there have been some things that have been prominent that hasn't been overtly anti-Semitic, but when you dig into it a little bit or put some context around it, it becomes anti-Semitic. For several years now, we've heard not just from prominent far-right people, prominent far-right pundits on television, but also some of our elected officials about the so-called Great Replacement theory in relation to immigration in the United States, blaming immigration on the left and among others. But it's important to note that the Great Replacement theory has its basis in anti-Semitic tropes of the 1920s. That doesn't stop many individuals who are elected to office to get up on or get behind a podium and to speak about it as though it's a real theory and it's something that's worth listening to. If we think about the ways that former President Trump talked about those who were overtly anti-Semitic, think about Charlottesville, where individuals walked up hills with tiki torches saying that Jews will not replace us, and Trump refused to condemn them, famously saying that there are good people on both sides. Again, not overtly anti-Semitic, but in what he didn't say, there's the message that Jews are worth looking down upon from the president of our country. Another example, one that I wasn't even aware of until earlier this week, on Holocaust Remembrance Day, Paul Gosar, who is famous for a lot of these dog whistles and a lot of these anti-Semitic tropes on social media, he tweeted, quote, "Remember when our government sent planes to Afghanistan and brought over 100,000 Afghans in less than a week? We have in the range of up to 40 million illegal aliens in this country. They can be deported by planes, trains, and buses. We could easily deport 6 million each year." That 6 million obviously being easily connected to the number estimated to have been killed during the Holocaust on Holocaust Remembrance Day. And finally, to show about how these sorts of statements actually do have an effect on the beliefs of the general population, a survey that just came out this past week showed that over half of people who claim to be right-wing believe that the country should be, or are sympathetic to the idea that the country should be Christian nationalist in nature. And although that in and of itself doesn't relate to anti-Semitism, the research further shows that there's a strong correlation between adherence to Christian nationalist values and anti-Semitism. So these words do have meaning. These kinds of things said by elected officials and those who have public pulpits, these words do have meaning. Now, what I want to talk about is how people interpret these kinds of messages and what it means for the audiences who are exposed to them. What we see, or what I see in my research, is that there are three main outcomes when people are exposed to these kinds of messages, even if there is no overt directive to engage in violence or to promote hatred. The outcomes that occur as a function of exposure to these kinds of messages lead to hatred and can lead to violence. Number one, when people are exposed to these kinds of messages, whether overt or covert, explicit or implicit, they develop beliefs that are consistent with those that are espoused in those messages. Individuals who might adhere to a more moderate Republican or moderate right-wing ideology, they might not be overtly anti-Semitic, but when they're exposed to things like the Gosars, the Mo Brooks, and people like that say that subvertly and carefully are carefully anti-Semitic, they start to grow beliefs related to those anti-Semitic tropes. Second, by using this kind of language, especially among those who are elected to office and those who are seen as credible messengers, people like a Tucker Carlson or, unfortunately, an Alex Jones, who some people considered at one point to be credible. When they see these messages coming from these individuals, it normalizes that language. And when that language is normalized, behaviors associated with those languages become normalized. People begin to think that speaking like this and acting like this are actual normal ways to behave in a functional society. When that occurs, people lose the tendency to believe that they shouldn't speak out in this way, that they shouldn't treat Jews as less than. So we normalize these kinds of messages and we normalize this behavior. And finally, when we see these kinds of messages, a third outcome occurs. And this relates to something called perceived behavioral control. When people normalize anti-Semitic communication, whether it be overt, covert, explicit, or implicit, if that kind of language has some sort of directive associated with it, what we see is that individuals come to believe that they have the power to affect change in the ways that those messages allude to. And when that happens, we see things like Charlottesville. We see things like happen at the Tree of Life Synagogue, where the individual who carried out the attack actually went online in, I believe, the day before the attack and quoted some of the things that he had heard from individuals on far-right outlets and on social media. So these kinds of messages that people are exposed to, they have these three different outcomes. They cultivate beliefs, anti-Semitic beliefs, they cultivate anti-Semitic norms, and they cultivate the idea that people can engage in behaviors that overcome what they see as Jewish leadership over them or some Jewish cabal that is out to get them. And when we take those three outcomes, that's when we begin to get in dangerous territory, because those three outcomes lead to behavioral intentions. And when those behavioral intentions allude to violence, violence is next. So my research looks at how we can understand this psychological process and hopefully how we can undermine it before the kinds of messages that people are exposed to and are protected by the First Amendment, how we can keep those from leading to violence against Jews and other kinds of populations that might be targeted by them. Now, I want to leave these solutions to these kinds of problems to Kathy, because I know she has a lot of very good ideas about this, and I'm sure we'll return to this phenomenon in the Q&A. But I guess want to kind of bring to the fore that although anti-Semitism has historically kind of been out front for the most part, increasingly in the last 10 years and even more so in the last 5 years, anti-Semitism and other kinds of hatred rhetoric, they're becoming more and more covert. And that covert nature makes it much more difficult to undermine. And hopefully Kathy has some good ideas for us. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thanks very much, Kurt. And now we'll turn it over to Kathy Berner. Thanks, Kathy.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me here to this panel. I'm going to break with the norms of the evening and show a presentation. I do have some slides, so bear with me while I pull those up. I really appreciate the way that our first two speakers have kind of laid out the problem and the current situation that we're dealing with anti-Semitism in the United States. The talk that I'm going to give is about countering online anti-Semitism. Now, there are lots of different approaches that we could take to responding to anti-Semitism. I'm really going to focus on one of those. So a piece of the solution is certainly looking at kind of policy level regulations, working with tech companies to think about what speech is allowed to stay up on social media and what's not. I'm really going to focus on what we call user-led responses, right? So this is what can all of us do as internet users to respond to harmful speech online. At the Dangerous Speech Project where I work, we call this counter speech, any direct response to hateful or harmful speech which seeks to undermine it. And I really love that I'm able to kind of have this presentation right after very useful comments from Kurt, especially thinking about this relationship between harmful speech and violence, right? The talk that I'm going to give is really thinking about what are people around the world doing to interrupt that relationship? What can everyday internet users do when faced with speech that is harmful online? So the work that we do is partially focused on looking at literature, on what researchers from around the world have done on the effectiveness of counter speech. And then a lot of our work is based off our work with counter speakers, right? I'm an anthropologist by training. And so when faced with a question like, does counter speech work? My first instinct is to go and talk to counter speakers. I have spoken to, 75 or so different counter speakers involved in various efforts around the world and ask them questions about what they're trying to accomplish, what strategies do they use, who are they trying to reach? And so that really forms the basis of our knowledge about the experiences of counter speakers. And then grounding that in literature, we're able to have some greater findings about what effectiveness looks like with counter speech. So that's what I'll talk about now. When we think about what counter speakers are trying to do, who they're trying to reach, we generally see two audiences. One of those audiences is the silent readers, so-called silent readers, right? These are not people who are actually spreading harmful speech online like anti-Semitism. These are people who are just on social media, often reading comments, not necessarily contributing to those comment threads, but they're there, right? They're being influenced by the speech. And then the other group that counter speakers tend to try and reach are the original speakers, the actual people posting hateful and harmful speech. Now, the strategies for reaching out to these two groups are different. And I'll share with you some different examples of people who are trying to do this, that specifically looking at responding to anti-Semitic speech. All right, so when we think about the silent readers, this is the group that most counter speakers are actually trying to reach. And it's not because they don't want to reach the hateful speakers, right? They would love to do that, but they are very practical in my experience. They understand that it's really, really hard to change the mind of someone who is posting hateful speech online. And it's a better use of their time to speak to this large reading audience. They generally say they're trying to do this for two reasons, right? They're either speaking to people who are in this, what's often called the movable middle, people who have relatively moderate beliefs or who haven't yet made up their mind about a particular topic, who aren't sure what the truth is and can be more easily swayed, or they're speaking to people who they assume have similar beliefs to them, but do not yet feel brave enough to speak out themselves. So they're trying to activate those individuals to become counter speakers as well. We know that this model of doing counter speech is well supported by the literature. Internet users take cues from others, both for good and for ill, right? So in a comment thread, if the first few comments are hateful, negative, antisocial, there's a higher chance that comments below those first comments are going to be similar, right? The same goes for positive comments. If the first comments are civil, fact-based, pro-social, there's a greater chance that more comments below those are going to be the same, similar in kind, right, in tone than those. Not all of the comments, but it does make an impact. So we know that people are using those speech norms to guide where they choose to participate and how they choose to participate online. This is a great example of a counter speech effort that tries to use this research to its benefits. This is Mina Dennert. She is an Iranian-born Swedish journalist and activist. And in 2016, she started noticing that speech in Sweden was changing, right? She'd always seen racism and xenophobia from the extreme figures online, but she started seeing it from people that she had once thought of as, quote, good people. So she started trying to respond herself, but she felt like when she did respond, her speech was either lost in this sea of toxicity or people turned their hatred against her. And that was very difficult for her emotionally to deal with. So she decided to do something about it. She invited 20 friends into a closed Facebook group, and then they would choose comment threads in which they would respond together. They would all go and write counter speech comments. And here's the trick. They would also like each other's comments. Now, for those of you who are kind of aware of the workings of Facebook, you know that on large public Facebook pages, comments are ranked by engagement, not in chronological order, which means the comments that have the most likes and replies float to the top, where the comments that have the fewest go to the bottom. Now, this group has really taken off, and the Swedish group that started with 20 people now has around 70,000 people. There are 15 groups around the country, around the world, including a group in the United States, and there are over 150,000 people who are involved in at least one of these groups. So let me show you how this works, right? Here's an example from the US group. This picture on the left is what we would see if you were in the closed Facebook group, right? They say action against anti-Semitism. Action is what they use to call out like group movement, right? So this is what they want people to respond to. The comment section under this article contains anti-Semitic comments. Let's intervene. Now, if you go on to, and then they link to the news article, the ABC News article. Now, if you go on the right side, you can see what it looks like on the NBC News Facebook page. Same article, and you'll see this first comment. This is yet another example of the rise of anti-Semitic violence in the United States. This should be unacceptable to everyone. I hope that justice is served. Hashtag I am here US, which is the name of the group. All of the groups around the world have in their own language, it's I am here, for I'm here too, my opinions matter too, right? And so because they've had 6 likes on this comment and a response from someone who's not a member of the group, it looks like, they were able to elevate this comment to the very top. Now, this has the ability to influence other speech norms within this comment section, right? As opposed to someone coming and seeing an anti-Semitic comment first, here they see a positive comment that is calling out the anti-Semitism of the article. So this is one example of one approach to counter speech. You'll see it's ranked by most relevant, not chronological order here. Here's another one. It's a very different approach. And I should say from the start, this Twitter account is no longer active. This was one called Anti-Semitism Cow. I'm a simple cow that moos at anti-Semitic stuff, right? So this is a very common response to hateful speech online. There are a couple others that you may have heard of also. Racism Watchdog, a dog that barks when he finds racism online. Or there's an account called Yes, You're Racist, right? Yes, You're Racist retweets tweets that contain "I'm not a racist, but," which is inevitably followed by something racist, right? Now, this is a really interesting response because when we think about hateful speech online, our instinct is to think the only solution to that is to decrease its presence, right? Remove it from view. And all of these accounts, and there are others that follow a similar model, take the opposite view. They're actually amplifying it, right? They are retweeting it and making it more visible. So how could this help us fight back against hatred online? Now, when I've interviewed the people behind Yes, You're Racist, the man who started it, his name is Logan Smith, he said that one of the reasons why he started it was he felt like right after President Barack Obama was elected, he heard a lot of people say, well, look, now we're a post-racial nation, right? We don't have to worry about racism anymore. There's this clear sign that we have moved beyond that. And he was thinking, have we really moved beyond this, right? Because I see racist stuff online all the time. And so he started this account by retweeting these kind of casually racist comments for two reasons. One was as a public education effort to make people aware that it was there, right? To let them see the racism that is online. And the second one was to uphold these discourse norms against it, right? By retweeting these things, they're kind of marking these as racism, as anti-Semitism, things that other people might say, well, it's not anti-Semitic, I'm just saying this. No, it is anti-Semitic, and we're going to call it that, right? And this upholds those discourse norms against those forms of speech. Again, both of these models are speaking to the reading audience. Logan will tell you that he knows that publicly shaming someone is not a great way to kind of get them to change their beliefs, but this is trying to reach that reading audience. Now, when we think about the original speaker, the ways to reach out to and change the beliefs or behavior of the original speaker, the research tells us it's very difficult to do this, right? As humans, we are remarkably good at ignoring information that runs counter to the things we already believe. It doesn't mean it's impossible, but it's difficult, right? We know from research that the number of counter speakers matters. So if there are more counter speakers who are trying to convince fewer people to change their beliefs or behavior, there's a higher likelihood that they'll have success than if the proportion is switched. We also know that the tone and the personal characteristics of the counter speakers matter. Does the counter speaker seem like someone that is like the person they are trying to speak to in some way? Do they seem like someone who has a good reputation online? Do they have a lot of followers, for example? All of these things make an impact in how successful people are in getting people to change their behavior. There are other ways, though, to change people's behavior. Now, there are lots of examples out there of people who use kind of an educational approach to try and have long, engaged conversations and encourage dialogue. And we have some examples where those succeed. The two examples I'm going to share with you are not these kind of engaged educational efforts to target someone's beliefs. I'm thinking these two both really focus on trying to change someone's behavior. So the first one relates back to something that we've already heard mentioned tonight, the march in Charlottesville. This was posted actually by Yes, You're Racist. He wrote, if you recognize any of the Nazis marching in Charlottesville, send me their names and profiles and I'll make them famous. Good night, alt-right. So when he posted this in 2017, the post had hundreds of comments below it of people who were trying to identify the men marching in this picture. And at least one person lost their job because of this post, because they were identified as this post. Now, one of the reasons why I like to share this example when I give talks about counter speech is that this is an example of trying to use kind of the power of the internet to impart change, right? But there can be consequences that are a bit unforeseen, right? So in the midst of these comments, these hundreds of comments where people are trying to identify people, there was at least one person who was misidentified. There was a man in one of the pictures who was wearing a University of Arkansas sweatshirt. He looked kind of like a professor at the University of Arkansas who was not at the rally, but he was identified as having been at the rally. And because of that, Logan would want me to tell you that he, as the account holder, did not personally kind of verify that that was who that was, but the man received death threats. His family, extended family, received death threats, had to move out of their house for a bit of time because the threats were seen as credible enough. So this is a good reminder that when we're doing counter speech online, it's not always that simple. It's not always kind of everything is positive and we're working toward making the world a better place, right? Whenever you kind of use the power of the mob online, as the person who is starting the account, starting the post, you can't control kind of what happens once you put this out there, right? So there are potentially negative consequences from doing something like this, from using this approach. The last example that I'll show just before ending is the way that online spaces have been used to organize people offline to respond to anti-Semitism. So the first example comes from something called Project Lemonade, right? This goes back to 2016 when white supremacists decided to call for a march against Jewish people in Whitefish, Montana. Whitefish, Montana is the home of Richard Spencer. They were called to do an armed march. The original posts included the names, phone numbers, and addresses of Jewish residents in Whitefish. And one of the responses to this was organized by several NGOs in the area called Project Lemonade. And they decided to collect donations that would be based on how many minutes the white supremacists marched in Whitefish. So people pledged money for each minute that the white supremacists march. And the money that was collected went to fund increased security for the Jewish community and new human rights and anti-hatred programming. So the idea was that they would raise money and give it to a cause that would be disliked by the white supremacist group that was marching. A similar model was used in Germany in 2014 in the town that was it's the burial site of Rudolf Hess. There was an annual neo-Nazi march there, and residents were really sick of this, right? And so they decided to have an involuntary walkathon for the neo-Nazis that came, pledged money for each meter that they walked. You can see over here on the right side of your picture, thank you, it's 5,000 euro, right, when they reached that point. And so the idea was that the money would be given to an anti-extremist organization in Germany, and that either the neo-Nazis would give up on their effort to march because they didn't want all of this money to be going to this organization in their name, or they would be kind of made the laughing stock of the country. Residents came out and cheered them on as they were walking because they were raising money, as you would in kind of a normal walkathon. These efforts, obviously, when we think about all of these counter speech efforts, none of these are the solution to the problem. I felt a little worried as the previous two speakers were talking, suggesting that I had the answers for you, because they aren't the complete answers, right? But they are little bits and pieces of ways that everyday people have tried to diminish the harmful effects of some of this anti-Semitic speech. I just want to make a quick note that this original in-person walkathon moved online to an organization called Donate the Hate, where it worked very similarly, where when hateful comments were posted online, people could donate money and there would be a little picture that would pop up and say, thank you for your comment. You know, $1 or €1 has been donated in your name to this organization that was against trying to solve the problem that the comment was causing. So there are lots of innovative things that people out there are doing. And in conclusion, I'll just say, why is counter speech important? Yes, it's not the full solution, but there are reasons why it matters, right? It upholds discourse norms against harmful speech, and that really does matter. Discourse norms are not static. They are not going to always stay in one place. We, as part of society, play a role in deciding what those discourse norms will be. And so all of these efforts make a point to allow that speech to not just stand there uncontested, right? It matters that someone goes on and says, I don't think that's right, this is wrong. We also know that it's much easier to be the second or the third person to jump in and say that's wrong, right? If no one says it first, if no one comes on and says this speech is wrong, then it's really hard for other people to join in. But if one person does it, it becomes much simpler for others to also agree and to condemn that speech. It also decreases the burden that's placed on the targets of hate speech to respond. That burden often falls to the targets. And if other people can take off some of that burden and be allies and respond first, right, to be that first responder, it takes some of the emotional weight off the targets. And it can lessen the power of hate speech against the targets because they recognize that it's not standing there uncontested. Not everybody believes that that is true. All right, I'll stop there. There's my email address if anybody has further questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kathy, and to all the speakers, Jeffrey and Kurt. So I'll just remind the audience that you can continue to post questions in the Q&A function by going to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. There was a lot in these presentations, and I sort of, I think one of the themes, at least between the first two presentations by Jeffrey and Kurt, was this sort of change in definition of anti-Semitism, or the change in nature of it. I mean, both of you expressed it in something like there was the past, you know, when anti-Semitism was in institutions, as Jeffrey said, or more in establishment institutions, and now it's more in the present, more difficult set of problems, more amorphous, since social media, extreme right and left, celebrities. And Kurt, you know, also said that in the past, people were more vocal about their biases, and now it's more an amorphous phenomenon. We have these things like the rhetoric and the great replacement theory, and opinions like, should we be a Christian nationalist country? And so my question, the first question, and there's a couple questions that I think will come out of this, is can we, you know, we could talk about anti-Semitism 1.0 and anti-Semitism 2.0 and maybe even anti-Semitism 3.0. I mean, I just wrote a list down on my, you know, in my notes here. You know, you can think of anti-Semitism 1.0 as the elders of Zion, right? And this idea of a Jewish conspiracy. And then 2.0 is when, well, that conspiracy and some of that, those, you know, dislike led to pogroms. But then you had Nazism and an ideology of the idea that the Jews were responsible for all the was wrong in the world. That was 3.0. That was something completely different. And then you have this idea of people being vocal about their bias in the United States and other places in the, you know, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And then you have this, you know, new amorphous anti-Semitism that Kurt and Jeffrey were talking about. And so I guess the first question is it actually helpful to call all these things anti-Semitism? You know, I run the Hannah Arendt Center, and so I'll just mention Hannah Arendt, who wrote an enormous amount about anti-Semitism, wrote probably 1,000 pages in her life, published on anti-Semitism in different forms or another. You know, made a distinction between what she called anti-capital S Semitism, which she said meant hatred of Jews, and anti-Semitism with a little s, one word, which she thought was the ideological doctrine that Jews were inferior and were causing the problems of the world and needed to be eliminated. And I'm just wondering to what extent we do ourselves a service when we call all these things anti-Semitism, and is there some need to break them apart and make some distinctions, or are they all dangerous and therefore have to be lumped together and called anti-Semitism? I'm wondering if that's something that any of you are willing to respond to or open to responding to. Kurt, go ahead.
Yeah, this has echoes of every debate I have in terrorism studies about what constitutes terrorism, what constitutes neo-Nazism, and everything else. I think it's important to distinguish that the idea that calling everything anti-Semitism and calling it all kind of dangerous because it's called anti-Semitism, I don't want to conflate those two things. I think even if we give them all different names, they'll still all be dangerous in their own respective ways. I am of the mind that in labeling something anti-Semitism, if it is anti-Semitic in the way that we think about hatred of Jews or a larger ideology like Arendt talked about, I think we're right to use that term. I'm of the mind too that too often we, and when I say we, I'm thinking of researchers of violent extremism and political violence and things like that. We back off our terms too much because we're looking to assuage the concerns of some group who takes umbrage with being called one thing or another. I think words mean things, and when a definition fits a term, I think we should stick with it. That said, I think there's also value in even if we do stick in calling everything that you've mentioned anti-Semitism, recognizing that there are different flavors of that and they'll have different solutions. That's the important thing, is that even if they all are forms of anti-Semitism, we need to approach them in ways that are uniquely usable or have utility in each of the cases.
Jeff, you're muted. You got to unmute.
I think that's right. Enormous amount of work has actually been done in providing definitions of anti-Semitism, and that can be discussed at a later date. These phenomena are complicated. They certainly, as was said, have different flavors, but I think there is value in keeping the name because it also says that there are historical linkages with hatreds of the past, that this is not merely a new thing driven by social media that's been recently discovered, but simply, or not so simply, the latest manifestation of ancient problems. And therefore, I'd very much like to keep the label while recognizing that there are a bundle of problems within it that have to be disaggregated and, it was said, addressed in different ways.
Now you're muted, Roger.
I see that. I'm sorry. Kathy, do you want to respond to that or not?
I don't think I have any thoughts that go beyond what Kurt and Jeffrey added, and I agree with what they say.
Good. So I'm just going to, if you don't mind, just because that's what I have to do as a moderator, I'm going to push this a little further. And I'm going to push it by using one of the questions that came up in the Q&A by Marty Schur. And it's a question to Kathy, although I don't know if it's specifically to Kathy, but it's to all of you in the way I'm framing it. And he writes, I agree with Nikki Haley, who just announced she's running for president, who said that she was a brown child in black and white world. She was bullied and teased and yet grew up to become governor in the same state. There are racists in the country, but the US is not a racist country. I mean, the way I interpret that within our context is there are anti-Semites in this country, but the US is not an anti-Semitic country. That goes to the question I think I was trying to ask before, right? To the extent, yes, there's no doubt there is hatred of Jews. There is no doubt there are racists. There's no doubt there are anti-Semites. There's no doubt that on exceptional levels, those hatreds can cause harms, murders, right? But the world is full of murders and harms. I mean, we've lived through enough of human history to know that's never going to go away. The world is full of prejudices. What I think Marty Schur is saying is we have racism, we have racial prejudices, but we're not racist. And I guess the analog of that is, well, we have anti-Semites, we have Jew hatred, but we don't have anti-Semitism. Does that make any sense to you guys or not? Kurt, you want to jump in again?
Yeah, I mean, this is going back to my epistemology class in graduate school, but, so I apologize for going back to that nightmare. But I think the debate there is academic and just saying, do we have racists or are we racist? Do we have anti-Semites or are we anti-Semitic? My response, and I don't mean to be flippant because this isn't meant to be a flippant answer, is who cares which one it is? There's a problem that needs solving, so why don't we address it, whether we call it anti-Semitic people or an anti-Semitic nation? For Marty, he may be right that there are racists in this country, but it's not a racist country. But if we concede that we're not a racist country, it doesn't change the fact that there are racists in the country causing damage. If we hold that it is a anti-Semitic country and Marty concedes, okay, you're an anti-Semitic country, that means there's still anti-Semites that need to be dealt with. So I understand the debate about saying there are racists versus it's a racist country, but I think the debate is largely academic, and where rubber meets the road on the ground, that distinction doesn't matter when people are dying one way or the other. It's just meant to make whoever's on one side of the debate feel better or worse about what position they took.
Thank you. Kathy, I don't know, the question was directed at you. I'm not sure why. Do you have a response to it?
I mean, what I can say, I'm not sure if there was a specific question in it or if it was just a comment directed at me, but what I would say that when we think about this idea that that there are racists in the country, but it's not a racist country, or putting it in the context of our talk today, that there are anti-Semitic people in the country, but it's not an anti-Semitic country, is a good reminder that there are a variety of beliefs that are held that are all kind of under, so there are a lot of a variety of beliefs that are held, right? And that's a good reminder if you're thinking about engaging with this kind of speech online or thinking about responding. One of the reasons why I think it's very helpful to think about responding to the silent readers, the people who aren't participating, is that we often get this skewed view of the beliefs that people have because we only look at the people who feel passionately enough to write comments online, right? I'm often reminding people that, Twitter is not representative of American beliefs, or of Facebook the same, right? It's representative of people who choose to write comments. And there are a lot of people who find themselves holding a more moderate position, or who just don't know, or who don't feel brave enough to speak out, who aren't participating in that conversation. And so there are many people who are not kind of represented by the beliefs that are there, and those are the people who it's worth speaking to. I guess that's the best response I have to that.
Thank you. Jeff, if you don't mind, I'm going to frame a question for you out of this directly towards around free speech, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, part of what I'm trying to tease out here, successfully or not, and let me say, this is something that's related to my own research right now, and it's very complicated, and I'm trying to tease it out, is in a sense the difference between prejudice and racism. Racism is, something that leads to real violence, but prejudices are opinions. And you and I know that opinions are protected by something called the First Amendment, or the idea of free speech. So if someone wants to say that white Christians are being replaced by minorities, that's an opinion. If then someone says, I'm going to take guns and go and kill people in Pittsburgh because of that, that's an action and racism. To what extent do we have to make it clear that while we can disagree with opinions, and we should, as Kathy says, counter them, they're opinions and they're part of our public discourse. At what level do they become something that, whether you want to call it fighting words or whether you want to call it something else, that they aren't, and isn't part of living in a pluralistic democracy allowing people to be prejudiced and even hateful so long as they don't act on it?
In the United States, there's constitutional guarantees, and now a firm body of jurisprudence about what the guardrails are in terms of speech for individuals, and also the guardrails for corporations. We've had to struggle a little bit with that in this era of social media, but I think it's still clear. I think we've seen in most cases that censoring or trying to have the government, and the First Amendment is about the government censoring people, generally does not work, and curtailing free speech almost invariably at the end of the day hurts minorities and those who are least powerful, because they are the ones who are the beneficiaries of enshrined rights, not the powerful who have their own mechanisms. The social media companies are a more complex issue, because as companies, publicly owned or privately owned companies, they do not fall under the First Amendment, and they have wide discretion in terms of what they're willing to tolerate on their platforms. Now, there's a debate about that also, but I agree fully with Kathy's project and what she's saying, which is, and I spent years of my life on this, more speech is the answer, not trying to figure out how you're going to curtail people, unless it's in the relatively small number of cases of kind of public shaming of individuals. I'm quite pleased that Kanye West lost his sponsorships from major corporations. I don't view that as censorship, because he can still say, the government still lets him say what he wants. For private companies, publicly owned companies, were under no obligation to continue to pay him once he had violated not only our public norms, but his contract with them. So we oftentimes struggle, but I think wind up in the right place in this country. And I think, Kathy's project, which she's described eloquently, is an example of more speech is better, as long as we understand that it's one arrow in a quiver of things to kind of combat not only this hatred, but all hatreds.
Yeah, I think that's really well put. So I just now ask you or Kathy, to what extent are we okay with counter speech and counter speakers and shaming when we agree with it, and when we disagree with it, we call it cancel culture? And isn't what you're talking about really cancel culture, just the cancel culture we agree with? And is that where we want to end up? Yeah, that's for you, Kathy.
Yeah, I mean, that is certainly one approach that some counter speakers take, right? It's not the only approach, and there are a lot of people that really choose not to engage in that kind of speech. The I Am Here group that I mentioned is really interesting, because they have very strict internal rules for how their members are supposed to respond, not in what they're actually supposed to say. They can voice any opinion that they want, but they're very strict on the way that they are supposed to voice those opinions, right? They have to be polite and civil and not make fun of what I think it's really just one of their requirements is to not make fun of anyone else's grammar, right? To not make fun of their spelling or their grammar in their comments. They're not meant to be condescending, because they understand this research that discourse norms are contagious, right? They're trying to change the way that people speak to each other online by upholding positive discourse norms, not in the opinions, but in the actual way they speak. So certainly there are counter speakers that are going that route and are trying to promote a better conversation culture online. But there are people that do public shaming, some of them in an organized fashion, kind of as the anti-Semitism cow, or anti-racism dog, or there are lots of things that emerge organically. A lot of us can remember Justine Sacco, the woman who was publicly shamed while she was on a plane after making racist comments, right? So these things do happen and they pop up. I don't know if it's certainly part of what we do, and it's part of, and it's not unique to internet culture. That's the other thing, right? Internet culture allows us to do this quickly. And there are concerns related to that because people don't always have their facts straight before they start canceling someone really quickly. And it can be hard for that person to then clear their name if there has been a mistake in what people are responding to. But the idea that human culture has used shame as a way to kind of shape behavior is not new to online spaces. Right. Whether or not we want to endorse that as something, and kind of, I can tell you when we train counter speakers, we don't train them to shame. Like, that's not something that we would say this is the ideal way to do this. But it is certainly something that is done and has an impact depending on kind of what goal the counter speaker is trying to accomplish.
I'm wondering I don't know if you do this kind of research or if Kurt does it or if you know people who do, but I mean, there's a question from Sam Groner, right? I don't know if you saw it, Kathy. I assume it's, I don't know if he or she, but wouldn't you concede that hate spreaders goad counter speakers and the resulting chatter raises the visibility of their screeds? And he says that, or she said, I don't know, says that's been my experience. I'm wondering, I can imagine, you're studying these counter speakers on the side of people who are anti-Semitism. But I imagine there may be similar groups of counter speakers on the side of the anti-Semites. And I can just imagine both of them sitting there, like typing their comments and liking each other's comments. And I'm wondering if there's any evidence that this actually works. Or if it's just like mutually assured destruction, that the arms race keeps getting higher and higher and higher. I don't know how does that work?
Okay, so I'll start answering this the way I kind of always answer these questions about, because it always boils down to this, right? Well, does it work? Like, why are we going to talk about it if we don't know whether it works? And the first thing I always say is, first, we have to decide what we mean by work, right? Because there are lots of different pathways that counter speech can work. It can work by getting people to post less hatred online. That's one way that it can work. It can also work by changing the proportion of hatred to counter speech, right? This is done either by getting people to change their mind and post something different, or by activating other counter speakers to come on and also condemn the negative speech. And we think that that can have this real, and there is quantitative research, right? Like large scale studies that are using natural language processing to look at speech trends over time that has shown that once counter speakers kind of collectively work together, that they are able to shift discourse trends over time toward more positive speech and away from hateful speech. There's some great studies that were done, actually kind of exactly what you're talking about. It was a very unique situation where there was a group of internet users that were promoting hateful speech in Germany, and a counter speech group formed specifically with the goal of countering that hate group, right? So they're going after each other, just arguments back and forth. And there are all of these crazy stories about the way they would kind of clog up each other's feeds by posting riddles and nursery rhymes and things. But yeah, it just it went on and on and on, but it gave a lot of data so that researchers could show how this is affecting speech over time. And it did seem to affect the discourse trends. But I think that there's also research showing that counter speech, although it's not great at getting the hateful speakers to change what they're posting, it can be really good at activating other counter speakers. And my qualitative research shows that and kind of tells the explanatory way of helping people feel braver to enter conversations. But there's quantitative work showing that that does actually happen as well. And so then you're seeing, instead of kind of the 5 hateful comments might still be there, but instead of 5 hateful comments with nothing responding to it, now you have 5 hateful comments with 30 comments condemning it. And that really makes a big difference when you're thinking about someone who's going to encounter that comment thread and read it, for them to kind of, what's the message they come away from that with, right? So I think that there really is emerging research. It's kind of a new field of research looking at this. But there are a lot of studies that are coming out now trying to show the different pathways through which counter speech can help us in this problem.
That's great. Thank you. Kurt, did you want to add anything to that or not? I didn't know if
Yeah, just very briefly, just a lot of the research that I do looks at not so much doing counter speech, but undermining the kinds of messages like anti-Semitic tropes before they appear by teaching people about manipulation techniques that are used on them. It's something I did a talk for Rhoda before on, it's called attitudinal inoculation, where if you can get to individuals and teach them about the manipulation techniques used on them before they're exposed to them, including those related to anti-Semitism, they're more likely to recognize them and reject them. And in that regard, I think it's important to note that the biggest strength that Kathy has, or anybody that is doing anti-Semitic speech, or no, anti-Semitic speech, yes, or is trying to counter and other kinds of hate speech, is that we have the truth on our side. So one of the things that we can leverage or do is help people be able to recognize when they're being manipulated, to help them be more literate with the kind of media they engage with. So when they do see an anti-Semitic comment and then another comment that undermines that or seeks to refute it, they'll be prepared to actually fact check both sides, and they'll actually be able to find truth about it. And the good thing about being on the anti-Semitic side is that the truth is generally on our side, because so many anti-Semitic tropes and communication are just underpinned by disinformation and outright lies. So we can expose that, and I think that's one solution that we should be doing.
Great. Jeff, do you want to add anything? I got some more questions that are coming through the chat, but
I'll just say what you prefaced it with on cancel culture. That's real, and that's a problem. And I think the tenor of this program among the three of us has been exactly right, which is not talking about how to censor people and cut them off, but how to enrich the conversation. And I think that's not only for anti-Semitism, but a whole bunch of issues across our society, the way to go. The easy play would seem to be for some people to stop people from speaking, to cancel them, which is different from, by the way, from cutting their commercial endorsements. It's a commercial decision, but it tends not to work and tends to backfire.
thank you. There's a couple of questions that are really interesting in the chat. One by Dennis Smith, who writes, in the early part of the 20th century, Jews who immigrated to the US clearly chose assimilation as a method to deflect anti-Semitism. Do you believe that choice increased or decreased the incidence of anti-Semitism, which we are seeing today? I mean, does assimilation work? Is that a response? And that doesn't mean you should or shouldn't. But I guess that's the question that Dennis is asking. I don't know if anyone wants to address that.
Yeah, I'm not sure assimilation was a choice. There were many opportunities in this country that Jews in the 20th century who came here, including my father, by the way, chose. Even though Jews have, in many ways been extraordinarily successful by rankings of education, income, and the like, it has not always protected them and may have exacerbated some of these issues. Although when they were less educated and they had less income relative to now and relative to the population, there was also anti-Semitism. So I think the issues have shifted, as we discussed at the beginning of the program, over time enough that the dynamics are really different. And as I said, I think this is important to bring in, the Israel issue also factors in this in a very difficult and complicated way, because it's the vector for some, but by no means all, of anti-Semitic vitriol, and it's in of itself a very complicated set of issues.
Great. Anyone else want to address that or not? Just trying to look a couple others. I mean, there is a question about self-defense, right? I think it was Jeff who mentioned the fact that a lot of synagogues in the United States are now increasingly I don't know, you know, you have certain kind of militarized elements to it. And there's a question about, you know, should Jews be encouraged to defend themselves? And they reference something in Pueblo, Colorado in 2019, where some a synagogue, I guess, sought to defend themselves against people with guns or things like that. To what extent is self-defense and militarization in response to militarization the right approach?
Well, look, this is an issue which we've dealing with as a society. You know, one guy tries to sneak explosives onto a plane in his shoe, and we take off our shoes when we board planes for the next 20 years. And it's a matter of risk, and our society is often very difficult at evaluating risk. I feel enormous sadness when I go to a synagogue and I'm met with armed guards who want to check my identity. At the same time, I completely get it. And I support the decisions of those who deployed those forces there. They're doing not only what they feel is necessary, but frankly, they're doing what their congregants are demanding for them to show up. It's the price of getting people to attend in some ways. I think there are natural barriers, and people may be surprised about the studies that show that armed guards often don't work. Arming people doesn't work. Metal detectors often don't work. So certainly people have the right to self-defense, but the idea that we're going to stamp this out by arming everyone or going to some other extreme, I just think is a false vision. And the unexpected consequences, or maybe even the expected consequences, will be severe and unpalatable.
Yeah, Kurt, I saw you wanted to respond as well. Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with almost everything Jeff said there. I just want to add two things. Again, I'll be the pragmatist. Number one, it's a Band-Aid for an axe wound, I think. If we're talking about trying to undermine anti-Semitism on a large scale, of course, everybody's entitled to self-defense if they feel they need it. And I would never besmirch anybody there or for anybody for exercising their Second Amendment rights. But I could see it causing more problems than it solves. And again, to be kind of the pragmatist, kind of a morbid idea here, the idea that if individuals have guns, they can stop violence being done to them, I think that's a false security. Guns aren't the only thing that's used to commit violence, and you can easily overcome if people are holding guns in a synagogue or in a church or in a school. There are other ways to cause violence to those people. So if people want to exercise their Second Amendment rights, they have every right to do so. But I don't think it would solve as many problems as it might seem like it would.
Kathy, is that a question you want to respond to?
No, I agree with what Kurt and Jeffrey said.
Okay, there's a question from Oded Haklai, which is very simple and which I think a number of you referenced in your remarks, which is there a qualitative difference, could ask qualitative or quantitative difference between expressions of anti-Semitism of the extreme right and anti-Semitism in the progressive milieu? I think a number of you actually mentioned the fact that it was from both the left and the right. You know, and the way Oded puts it is the extreme right and the progressive milieu, not the extreme left. Does that matter? I mean, is anti-Semitism an extremity on the right and mainstream on the left, or is that not right? How do you guys parse this issue?
I mean, quantitatively, and I'm a quantitative researcher, if you just look at the sheer numbers of plots, attacks, number of people killed, number of weapons used, the attacks come from the right. That doesn't mean that there aren't anti-Semitic people. Get back into this debate. Is the left anti-Semitic versus there being anti-Semitic people there? That doesn't mean they're not there. It's just that when we look at all the data that we have, related to where violence against Jews comes from. It comes from the far right. Now, if we use that as a starting point, I think the difference is that I guess she called it the progressive milieu. If you call it coming from the left, it seems to be less inclined towards violence than from the right. But if we look at anti-Semitism from the right, it seems to be much more likely to end in violence than from the left. If we consider the data that we have on extremist attacks in the US to be accurate.
Anyone else? I mean, I know that in the UK, they had a prime minister a couple of years ago on the left who was considered by many people to be quite anti-Semitic. Would that fit in with your analysis, Kurt? I mean, does that change, or is that something you've looked at?
No, I mean, I'm mostly a violence researcher, and I'm interested in violent outcomes. And I would absolutely agree that anti-Semitism and other kinds of hatred are completely pervasive across the political spectrum. It's just that it seems to me that individuals on the right who are anti-Semitic, and again, I'm saying individuals specifically because it is a small proportion of people who engage in violence, but those that do seem to come from the right far more than they come from the left.
I do think, if you're referencing Corbyn, he didn't become prime minister, but I think that's a salutary example, because on the one hand, Labour was infused with a profound anti-Semitism, which has had different origins, and British anti-Semitism has a long history too. But the Israel issue was definitely an important part of it. Even though Jews are a very small fraction of the UK population, one of the reasons Corbyn and Labour lost, and lost decisively, was because they were seen as anti-Semitic. That was, this conversation has been by its nature somewhat depressing and sad that we've had to go there. But the UK example stands out that anti-Semitism not only was not a winning play, it was actually a losing play. And British Labour has done, and there was a speech yesterday, very important work in terms of dissecting its losses and trying to rid itself of some of the most prejudicial actors, including banning their former leader from running for parliament under their aegis in the future, which is quite an extraordinary step. So this was done not by canceling Corbyn or censoring him. It was done by shining a light on what was being said. And I think that's a very important example.
I mean, there are efforts now to strip people in the Democratic Party of certain positions by the other party, the Republican Party, because of so-called anti-Semitism. Is that similar to that, or is that different in your mind, Jeff?
Well, Corbyn was, I happen to oppose all people being stripped of their committee assignments outside of a process. So I don't even have to go to the Democrats and anti-Semitism or what was done in the previous Congress. I'll just say, as a university administrator, we've tried in our various platforms, as have so many of my colleagues across the country, to have a wide variety of speakers on lots of different issues. At American Jewish University, not surprisingly, Israel is a real touchstone issue. And we've had a large number of people from very different points in the ideological spectrum, from Bibi Netanyahu to his strong opponents. And I'm always struck that we have to deal with a conversation on every controversial speaker, whether he or she is from the left or the right, which is, why are you endorsing this person? And we have to say over and over again, we're not endorsing this person. We think that their views are important to explore. And we generally get to the right place with our audience saying that. And I think there is an appetite and an understanding in this country that while people may not be able to recite the words of the First Amendment, It's embedded in our cultural norms in important ways if we can, Kathy said some of this, activate those concerns. And I think that at the end of the day, that gives me hope.
I'm gonna, I guess, let me ask one last question and let you all respond. Is that all right, Rhoda?
Yes, absolutely. I want to get all the questions answered.
Um,
Thank you.
So there's a question by an anonymous attendee, which is, have we seen a rise in just anti-Semitism or a rise in many forms of hatred, bigotry, and racism against Asian Americans, et cetera? And a number of you mentioned this. And I guess the question I want to ask is, I mean, I've encountered this in sort of the other way when I've said, well, you know, anti-Semitism is a form of racism. Many people in the academic world who I have spoken with have said, no, racism is fundamentally different than anti-Semitism. It's much worse, right, in America, that it's an American thing. And yet there's also a line of reasoning that anti-Semitism is much older and much richer in history and is sort of the racism. I guess, to what extent, I get the question that would like you guys to all answer, or at least opine on, is this all one thing? I mean, to what extent is anti-Semitism, racism, anti-Asian Americans, anti-trans, et cetera, is this all something we study together, or do these have to all be studied independently as separate things, and is one, you know, and do we have to really look at them individually? Okay, Kathy, you start.
Sure, I'll start. I think that there's value in looking at them in both ways, right? There is value at looking at the way that speech that other groups and creates a sense of threat that can lead to violence, right? That is useful in thinking about this as a whole, but there's also a lot of value in thinking about each of these separately. So at the Dangerous Speech Project, we study dangerous speech, which we differentiate from hate speech because it is speech that can lead to violence, right? And a lot of that is hateful, but it's not all hateful. And for us, it's more appropriate to think about it as kind of fear speech. It's speech that makes people feel that members of another group pose a threat to them, right? This is often based off disinformation, misinformation, but it often has particular rhetorical patterns that exist. So those rhetorical patterns we see directed against lots of different groups. So the idea that another group is seen as a threat can function very similarly when we're thinking about different groups, whether it's racist speech or misogynistic speech or anti-Semitic speech, right? But there are contextual differences in all of these different things that help us craft better interventions to respond. So I don't think that we should say we can only look at them together or only see them as separate. We need to look at all of this information together in the same way that you would look at interdisciplinary research together. You get a better, clearer picture that can craft better interventions when we see it all as one full but also detailed picture.
Thank you. Kurt, you want to take a final slot?
Couldn't have said it better than Kathy just did. I mean, the idea that, I mean, we do have a number of problems here, but the big reason that people turn toward a radical viewpoint, maybe turn toward violence, one of the common threads is the perception that that group that they decided needs to be attacked is a threat to their way of life. And that can be Jews, that can be African Americans, that could be women, that could be immigrants, that could be anybody. I don't have the data that Kathy has with respect to the rhetorical patterns, but just qualitatively looking at what I've seen in extremist propaganda, you can cut and paste it. And I mean, it's not just in the United States either. Like one of the ironies in studying extremism is you note that a lot of the same excuses that anti-Semites use for why they don't like Jews are the same reason that ISIS uses and the same reason that Hamas uses. Yeah. So you see you see these rhetorical patterns and it does make it easy to think about them similarly because of psychological phenomena that drive extremism. But I do think the reason that Kathy said we need to think of them separately is because there are nuances to each ideology that benefit from being targeted. So thinking about them separately in that way is useful, but it's also important to understand that people approach their hate in very similar ways.
Right. Jeff, you get the last word on this, or anything you want to say?
I agree fully with that contextual variables and understanding how these things are flowing is important, yet the specific phenomena, anti-Semitism or racism, homophobia, misogyny, have to be understood for their specific dynamics also. At the moment, they still seem to be going much the same way. You know, as you said, I was previously president and CEO of the museum, and we celebrated social media as the greatest explosion of free expression that the world has ever seen. And we celebrated that. We also have to understand that, you know, the audience is now speaking, and some of the things the audience is saying are unpalatable and potentially dangerous. And that's all part of this. And I think we can celebrate this explosion of free expression, that people have been empowered, that the institutions which monopolized information and opinions in the past have been dismantled or disempowered, and there's a tremendous amount of good in that. That's happened in an extraordinarily short period of time. And I think as a society, we're reaching for ways now to enter into this new era where expression is possible, but at the same time, potentially dangerous. It's frightening, but I think there are also tremendous opportunities for eventual better understanding.
I think it's a great way to end the idea that, look, to live in a pluralist democracy with the kind of enormous amounts of religions, races, languages, cultures that exist in the United States and in many now pluralist democracies around the world, it's not easy. And, to free people to speak is going to mean you're going to get a lot of hate, a lot of prejudice, because it is human to be hateful and prejudiced. I don't know any human who's not, right? Even the saints. We all have prejudices against somebody. So then the question is, how do you address that? And I think this panel has done an amazing job of showing us the problems, but also pointing us towards some potential ways to respond and alleviate those dangers. So thank you all very much. And I'll turn it over to Rhoda
I want to echo what you said, Roger. It was a phenomenal presentation tonight. Great discussion. I hope the audience learned a lot, because I know I did, and there's so much to think about and so many new ideas that I didn't even have an idea about before. And it's so great that you were all here to help us better understand this very complex issue. So I want to send all my thanks to you, Roger, for doing a great job, Kathy, Kurt, and Jeffrey. And we'll probably be returning to this subject or something similar in the future, and I hope to see you back. Thank you so much for a great time, great learning, and a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thanks,
all.
Rhoda. Thanks, Roger.
Thank you very much.
Thank you guys.
Bye-bye.